I was the doctor in Wells Hollow the autumn Levi Thorne rode down out of the Blue Notch, and I have lived long enough now to be the last man who saw the whole of it. I have buried nearly everyone else who could tell you. So you will have to take an old man's word for what a young man's eyes saw, and I will tell it plain, because plain is the only way it deserves to be told. It started the day Ezekiel Hale's men rode 3 homesteaders off their claims before noon, and not one soul in town lifted a hand. I was standing on the boardwalk outside my office with a splint half-tied around the Peterson boys' wrist when they came down Main Street, 4 of Hale's riders driving a wagon ahead of them, and on that wagon sat old Mercer and his wife and everything they owned in the world, which was not much, a rope bed and a churn and a crate of hens still squawking. Mercer had homesteaded the flat below the notch for 11 years. His hands were the color of saddle leather, and he did not look at any of us as the wagon rolled past. He looked straight ahead at the road out of town, and his wife had her chin up like she was daring the street to say something, and the street said nothing. I said nothing. God forgive me, I want that on the record. I stood there with a child's wrist in my hands, and I watched a good man be run out of the valley he'd built, and I told myself I had a patient to see to. The riders slowed as they passed the mercantile. The one in front, a lean man named Cole Gantz, who did Hale's ugliest work and smiled while he did it, tipped his hat to the whole street like a man being neighborly. "Morning," he called out, pleasant as you please. "Fine morning to mind your own affairs." And we did. That was the shame of Wells Hollow that season. We minded our own affairs while the valley was taken out from under us one homestead at a time, and we told ourselves it was somebody else's turn to be brave. The only person on that street who did not lower her eyes was Clara Denton. She was standing in the schoolhouse doorway at the top of the rise with a dozen children behind her, and she had come out to see what the noise was, and she did not go back in. She stood there in her gray dress with her hands folded, and she watched Cole Gantz the way you'd watch a snake in the woodpile, not afraid exactly, but knowing precisely what it was. When the wagon reached the top of the road, she stepped down off her porch and lifted her hand to old Mercer, just lifted it, and Mercer saw her, and something in his face broke and mended at the same time. He touched his hat brim. His wife wept then, finally, when someone was decent enough to say goodbye. Cole Gantz saw it too. He reined in. "Schoolteacher," he said, "you ought to teach those children to keep their eyes down. Safer that way." "I teach them their letters, Mr. Gantz," Clara said. Her voice carried the whole length of the street. "Keeping their eyes down they can learn from watching grown men." There was a silence you could have poured into a cup. Then Gantz laughed, that soft laugh he had, that meant nothing good, and rode on, and the moment passed, and the street went back to breathing. I finished the Peterson boy's splint. My hands were not quite steady, and I hoped he did not notice. When I looked up, the schoolhouse door had closed, and the children were inside again, and I could hear, faint on the wind, the sound of Clara Denton starting them on their sums, as if the world had not just tilted an inch further toward the dark. You have to understand who she was to us. Clara had come to the Hollow 6 years before, a young widow with her sister's boy in tow. Her husband had died of the fever their first winter married, I never knew him, and her sister and the sister's husband had gone the same year to a wagon smash-up on the fallow road, and Clara had taken the boy, Sam, and kept on. She could have gone back east. She had people there, I gathered, though she never spoke of them. She stayed. She took the schoolhouse because the town had no teacher, and she had a boy who needed one, and a will that would not let a thing go undone once she'd set her hand to it. Sam was 9 that autumn. A serious child, all elbows, with his aunt's straight look and a stammer that came on him when he was frightened or excited, which he hated, and which Clara had a way of stilling just by putting 2 fingers on his shoulder. She loved that boy the way you love the thing you have left when everything else has been taken. Fiercely and quietly, and without ever once making him feel he was a burden she carried. The schoolhouse sat on the rise at the north end of town, and behind it was the spring. That spring is the whole of it, so let me tell you about the spring. Wells Hollow had one good year-round water source, and it came up cold and clean out of the rock behind the schoolhouse and ran down through town to the flats below. Every homestead in the valley drank from it or watered stock from the creek it fed. The schoolhouse land and the spring on it had been deeded to the town years back by a man named Abel Wells, who founded the place and gave it his name, and then had the grace to die before he could see what became of it. It belonged to all of us. That was the point. It belonged to no one man, and so it belonged to everyone, and that was exactly the thing Ezekiel Hale could not abide. Hale had come into the country 4 years earlier and bought up the old Crandall cattle outfit, and then he had set about the patient work of owning the rest. He was not a loud man. I want to be fair to the memory even of him. He did not ride around firing pistols in the air. He bought notes. He bought debts. He waited for a hard winter and then offered a homesteader half what his claim was worth and let the man understand without ever quite saying it that half was better than what would happen if he refused. He got the flats that way, and the South Range, and the timber up the east side. And that autumn he had turned his patient, terrible attention to the one thing he did not yet own, which was the water, and the water sat on Clara Denton's schoolhouse land. He made his offer through the town council first, all proper. He would buy the schoolhouse land and build the town a fine new school on a better lot, and pipe water down to everyone from the spring, for a reasonable fee. It sounded like generosity if you did not listen closely. The council listened closely, or Clara made them, and what it came to was this. Hale would own the water, and every man in the valley would pay him to drink, and the day any man crossed him the water would stop. The council was 5 men and 4 of them were ready to sign. They were not wicked men. They were tired and afraid, and they had seen what happened to men who told Ezekiel Hale no. The 5th was Clara. She'd been put on the council because she held the schoolhouse deed in trust and no one else would take the seat, and Clara would not sign. And as long as one trustee of the town land would not sign, Hale could not buy it lawful. So Hale set about the patient work of changing Clara Denton's mind. It started small, a window in the schoolhouse broken in the night. The word Hale scratched into the well cover behind the school, as if to say this is mine already, you only don't know it yet. Clara's woodpile scattered. Nothing you could take to the marshal, and anyway the marshal was a decent, useless man named Prout who had long since decided that the way to keep the peace was to see nothing. Then Cole Gantz took to walking his horse past the schoolhouse at the end of the day slow, when the children were let out, just riding by and looking, and the children stopped playing in the yard, and the mothers started coming to fetch them at the door. The morning they ran the Mercers out was the morning Hale meant everyone to understand that his patience was not endless, and it worked. That evening I watched 3 families load wagons of their own, not run off, just leaving, deciding the hollow was not a place to raise children anymore. The town was dying on its feet, and it was dying the worst way a town can, which is quietly, with everyone agreeing not to mention it. That was Wells Hollow the evening Levi Thorne rode down out of the notch on a gray horse, with his hat pulled low and 2 days of trail dust on him, looking for nothing but a meal and a bed, and finding instead the last fight of a certain kind of man. I saw him come in. I was crossing to the livery to check on Tandy Boone's stove-in foot, and I heard the horse first, that unhurried walk, and I looked up and there he was coming down the grade in the last of the light. A tall man, spare, gray coming into his beard, though he was not so old as that made him look. He rode easy and watchful both, the way a man rides who has learned the hard way to look at doorways and rooftops. He had a rifle in a scabbard under his knee, and a pistol worn low and worn plain, no silver on it, the gun of a man who used it and did not want to talk about it. He rode down Main Street and every head that saw him turned, and he did not seem to notice, or he noticed everything and had simply decided long ago not to let it show. He put his horse up at Boone's livery, and I was there when he did it. And I remember he ran his hand down that gray's neck and murmured something to it I didn't catch, gentle, before he handed Boone 2 bits and asked where a man could eat. Boone, who was frightened of his own shadow that season, pointed him to the Hollow's one boarding house, the Vane place. My Aunt Hetty ran it, which is how I come to know so much of what followed, and the stranger touched his hat and walked off up the street carrying his saddlebags and his rifle and nothing else. "You know who that is?" Boone said to me low when he was gone. "No, that's Levi Thorne." Boone said the name the way you'd say the name of a bad winter. "Killed the Ardmore brothers down in Sabine country. Killed a lot of men. They say he," and here Boone lowered his voice further, as if the man might hear him through the walls. "They say he don't hardly speak. Just does the thing and rides on." I did not know then how much of what men said about Levi Thorne was true, and how much was the kind of story frightened men build around a quiet, dangerous stranger. I know now that the truth was worse and better than the stories, the way the truth generally is. But that first evening all I knew was that a gunfighter with a reputation had ridden into a town that was already afraid, and I went home uneasy, and I was right to be, though not for the reason I thought. He ate at my Aunt Hetty's table that night with 4 other boarders, and Hetty told me after that he said perhaps a dozen words the whole meal, please and thank you, and the food was good, ma'am, and that he ate like a man who had not counted on the meal being good and was quietly grateful it was. When one of the boarders, a drummer selling patent medicines, got to talking loud about the doings in the valley, about Hale and the Mercers, and how a smart man kept clear of another man's troubles, Thorne set down his fork and looked at the drummer for a while, not angry, just looking, until the drummer found something else to talk about. That was all. But Hetty said the temperature at the table dropped 10 degrees and came back up when Thorne looked away, and she could not have told you why. He meant to ride out in the morning. I am as sure of that as I am of anything. He was passing through. He owed Wells Hollow nothing, and a wiser man, a colder man, the man his reputation made him out to be, would have saddled the gray at first light and gone on to wherever he was going and let us drown in our own cowardice. He nearly did. What stopped him was the schoolhouse. He came out of Hetty's in the gray of morning to saddle up, and the schoolhouse sat on the rise above the boarding house, and the children were already gathering for the day, and Clara Denton was ringing the bell. And on the road below the schoolhouse, blocking it, sat Cole Gantz and 2 other of Hale's men on their horses, waiting. I had come up early myself. The widow Sorensen's cough had turned bad in the night, and she lived past the school, so I saw all of it, from the bottom of the rise, and I have gone over it in my mind 10,000 times in the years since, and I will give it to you the way it happened. Gantz had a paper in his hand. He was making a show of it. As the last of the children filed toward the door, he nudged his horse up the road, slow, herding, the way you'd move stock, until the animal was near enough to the children that little Ada Peterson shrank back and started to cry. Gantz smiled down at her. "Miss Denton," he called. "Mr. Hale's had his lawyer look into that old deed of yours. Seems there's a flaw in it. Seems this land might not be so free and clear as you've all been telling yourselves." He waved the paper. "Might be it belongs to Mr. Hale after all, going back to a note old Wells never settled. Sad thing, but the law's the law." He let his horse take another step, right into the yard now, scattering children. "We'll need you out by the end of the month, school and all, nothing personal, you understand." Clara had come down off the porch. She had Sam by her side. The boy would not leave her. I saw him grip her skirt, and I saw her hand go to his shoulder, 2 fingers the way she did, and she stood in the yard between Cole Gantz's horse and the frightened children, a small woman in a gray dress with her chin up, and she said, "Get off this land, Mr. Gantz. It belongs to the town and you know it, and no lawyer's paper you wave at a bunch of children is going to change that. Get off it." Gantz stopped smiling. That was the dangerous thing about Cole Gantz. The smiling was the safe part. When the smile went, the trouble came. "Now that's no way to talk," he said softly, and he swung down off his horse, and the 2 men with him swung down too, and they came toward her across the yard, unhurried, 3 men against a woman and a boy in a doorway full of crying children. And the mothers who were there screamed and pulled their little ones back, and not one man on that street, not Boone, not Prout the marshal who was standing right there, not me, God forgive me, not me, moved a single step. And a voice from the boardwalk said, "That's enough." It was not loud. I want you to know that. Everyone always tells it that he shouted, and he did not. He said it the way you'd say it to a dog that had gotten into something flat, tired, certain. That's enough. And every head on that street turned, and there was Levi Thorne standing beside his saddled gray with the reins loose in one hand, not even mounted, a man who had been 30 seconds from riding out of our lives forever, and he was looking up the rise at Cole Gance with an expression I can only call weary. Gance turned, sized him up. Did not know him, I could see that, could see Gance reckoning the stranger for a fool. "This ain't your business, mister," Gance said. "Ride on." "I mean to," Thorne said. "In a minute." He dropped the gray's reins. He did not hurry. He walked up the rise easy, hands loose at his sides, and there was something in the way he walked that made the 2 men behind Gance go still, some animal knowledge that arrives ahead of the mind. "You've got 3 grown men," Thorne said, "come to move a schoolteacher and a lot of children off their water, and down here you've got a whole town of men watching you do it and none of them stopping you." He stopped a few feet from Gance. "I've seen a lot of low things. I don't believe I've seen one much lower than that. Do you know who I ride for?" "No," Thorne said, "and I don't much care, but I'll tell you what I know." He looked past Gance then at Clara, and something in his face changed, just for a second, just a flicker before it shut again, then back to Gance. "I know you're not going to touch that woman, and I know you're going to get on your horse and take your paper back to whoever wrote it, and you're going to tell him a man told you that land's not for sale. You want to argue it, we can argue it, but not in front of these children. Choose." There is a thing that happens between 2 men when one of them has killed before and the other has only made others afraid. It is not spoken. Cole Gance looked into Levi Thorne's eyes, and he read there, the way I read a fever in a man's face, exactly what he was standing in front of, and I watched the courage go out of him from the boots up. He was still smiling when he backed away, but it was a sick smile. "You're making a mistake, friend," he said. "A big one." "Made bigger ones," Thorne said. "Go on." They went. They mounted and rode down the rise and out of town, and Cole Gance did not look back. And when they were gone, the whole street let out a breath at once, and Ada Peterson was still crying, and somewhere a rooster crowed like an idiot into the silence, and Clara Denton stood in her schoolyard with her hand on her boy's shoulder and looked at the stranger who had just made an enemy of the most dangerous man in the valley on her behalf, and she did not thank him. That is the thing I remember most. She did not gush, did not weep, did not fall on him grateful. She looked at him a long moment with those level gray eyes, and she said, "You shouldn't have done that." Thorne almost smiled. "No, ma'am, probably not. He'll come back. And there'll be more of them, and they'll be angrier, and you'll be gone. You'll ride out, and we'll still be here." It was not ungrateful. It was true, and she was the only person on that street with the spine to say the true thing to his face. "So thank you," she said, "and I mean it, but you shouldn't have done that unless you meant to see it through, and you don't look like a man who stays." Thorne looked at her for a while. The children had gone quiet, watching. Sam was watching hardest of all, that serious 9-year-old face turned up at this man who had walked up a hill and moved 3 armed men with his voice. "No, ma'am," Thorne said at last. "I don't stay." And he turned and walked back down the rise to his horse. And then he didn't ride out. He stood by the gray with his hand on the saddle for a long time, and the town watched him, and I do not know to this day what passed through that man's mind in those minutes. I have my guess. I think a man who has done the things Levi Thorne had done spends the back half of his life looking for something he can set right, some one thing to lay against the scale, and I think he had ridden past 100 towns telling himself none of them were his to save, and I think that morning he found he could not tell himself that anymore. Something about the woman who thanked him and told him to go in the same breath. Something about the boy's face. He led the gray back to Boone's livery and put him up again. And he walked up the street to my Aunt Hetty's and told her he'd be staying on a while and paid her a week in advance, and that was that. The gunfighter stayed. I met him properly that afternoon, because Cole Gantz, backing his horse out of the schoolyard, had crowded Boone's fence, and Boone had cut his hand bad on a nail trying to get clear. And I was stitching Boone up in the livery when Thorne came to see to his horse, and Boone introduced us with his hand still bleeding, and Thorne watched me work with the interest of a man who respected competence in any line. "You're the doctor," he said. "Josiah Vane, such as the Hollows got." He nodded. "You'll be busy," he said, "before this is done," and there was nothing dramatic in how he said it. He said it the way I'd tell a man his leg was broken, a statement of the case. "You aim to fight Ezekiel Hale," I said, "by yourself." "I aim to stay a while," Thorne said, "and see what's what." He finished with the gray and hung the currycomb on its nail and stood in the livery door a moment looking up the street toward the schoolhouse on its rise, where the sound of children reciting drifted down on the afternoon air, and he said, half to himself, "Man ought to be able to send his children to school without armed men in the yard. That's not much to ask." "No," I said, "it isn't. But nobody here'll fight for it." "They're afraid," I said, and I heard how thin it sounded even as I said it. "Hale's ruined men who crossed him, taken their land, their credit. Marshal Prout won't move. We've got no law but Hale's." Thorne looked at me. It was not an unkind look, but it was a clear one, and I have thought about it my whole life. "You're all afraid of losing what you've got," he said. "I understand that. Only thing is," he nodded up the hill, "she's already decided she'd rather lose it standing than keep it kneeling, and she's got the least of any of you to lose, and a boy besides. Makes a man wonder what the rest of you are waiting for." He touched his hat. "No offense meant, Doctor." "None taken," I said, and it was a lie because it landed square and I deserved it. That was Levi Thorne. He did not lecture and he did not preach. He just said the plain true thing and let it sit on you, and it sat, and it worked on a man like water on a stone. Now I will not pretend I know all of what passed between him and Clara Denton in the weeks that followed, because much of it passed where no one saw. But I saw enough, and Hetty saw the rest, and between us we can tell it true. He took to walking up to the schoolhouse, not obvious about it. He'd be at the livery, and then he'd be up the rise, checking on nothing, standing off to the side while the children played in the yard where lately they'd been afraid to. And Cole Gantz did not ride past the school anymore, because now there was a man there who Cole Gantz did not want to ride past, and the children came back out into the sunshine, and their mothers stopped coming to fetch them at the door, and the yard filled up again with the racket a schoolyard is supposed to make. It was the first thing to come back to life in Wells Hollow in a year, and it came back because a gunfighter with a bad name stood at the edge of it with his arms crossed and let his shadow fall over it like a roof. Clara did not thank him for it, not out loud, not again, but I saw her start leaving a plate for him. She'd send Sam down to the livery with a covered dish cornbread, a wedge of pie, a bit of the children's lunch she'd made too much of on purpose, and Sam would carry it down with great seriousness, and Thorne would take it with great seriousness, and the two of them developed a whole grave friendship over these deliveries that neither of them ever discussed. The boy took to following him, and here is a thing about Levi Thorne that the stories never told. He let him. He let that stammering, serious boy trail him around the livery and hand him things while he saw to the gray, and he answered the boy's questions. Sam had 1,000 of them, with a patience I would not have credited in such a man. Sam asked him once, right in front of me, whether he had really killed the Ardmore brothers, and Thorne was quiet a while, and then he said, "Yes, just that." And Sam, being 9, asked why, and Thorne set down what he was holding and crouched to the boy's level, which I never saw him do for a grown man, and he said, "Because I was young and angry, and I thought that was how you settled things. And it wasn't. And I've spent a long time being sorry." He looked at the boy hard. Don't you ever think it's how you settle things? You hear? You settle things with your head and your word and your two hands doing honest work. The guns for when there's nothing left. And there's almost always something left. Sam nodded, that solemn 9-year-old nod. And the stammer, I noticed, did not come on him at all when he talked to Thorn. Not once. There was something about the man's stillness that made a frightened boy feel safe enough to get the words out clean. Clara noticed it too. I know she did because she watched them from the schoolhouse porch, the tall man and her boy at the livery down the hill, and there was a look on her face those evenings that I did not have a name for then but do now. It is the look of a woman who has carried a thing alone for a long time and sees, for the first time in years, someone standing where she might set part of it down. She did not trust it. She was too clear-eyed to trust it, but she saw it. The turn between them, if I can call it that, came the night of the Sorensen fire. The widow Sorensen's cough that had taken me up the hill that first morning, it went to her lungs, and she died, quiet in the second week, and she had no one. And so the burying fell to the town, which meant it fell to Clara, because Clara was the one who did the things no one else would. It was Clara who washed the old woman and sat with the body and organized the digging of the grave, and it was Thorn, without being asked, who dug it. I watched him. A gunfighter with a reputation from here to Sabine country, stripped to his shirt in the cold, digging a poor widow's grave in hard ground because the woman because it needed doing and Clara had set her hand to it, and he found he could not watch her do it alone. They buried the old woman at dusk, and the wind came up cold off the notch, and afterward Clara asked him into the schoolhouse for coffee, because it was cold and he had dug all day, and there was no scandal in it because Sam was there and half asleep by the stove, and they sat, the three of them, in the warm schoolroom with the coffee, and Hetty, who had come to help lay out the body and was tidying in the next room, heard some of what was said, and told me, and I give it to you as she gave it to me. Clara said, you could have anything, a man like you. Ride into any town, hire out your gun, name your price. Why are you digging graves in a town that's going to lose anyway? And Thorn was quiet a long time, Hetty said, and then he told her. He had had a wife once, and a boy. Down in the Sabine country, years back, before the killing that made his name. He'd had a small place and a family, and he'd meant to be a farmer, and there had been men like Hale, men who bought other men's land with fear, and they had come for his water, his little creek, and he had gone to the law, and the law had been theirs, and he had done nothing. He had waited. He had told himself he was being wise, right up until the night they burned him out to make the point, and his wife and his boy had died in that fire while he was in town being wise. And the Ardmore brothers had been the men who said it. And that was why he'd killed them, and the men after them, and all the men that came after that. Because once he'd let the thing that mattered burn while he stood being careful, and after that he was a different creature, a man with nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose, and he'd made himself into a gun and pointed it at bad men for 20 years, and it had never once brought back what was taken. So you ask me why I'm digging graves in a town that's going to lose, Thorn said. It's because I've spent 20 years being too late, and I'm tired of it, and this time I got here first. Hetty said Clara didn't say anything for a while, and then she said, very quiet, my husband would have liked you. He was a gentle man. He'd have hated everything you've done, and he'd have understood every bit of why. And Thorn said, I don't reckon a gentle man could understand it. And Clara said, you'd be surprised what a person can understand once they've had the thing they love taken. And Hetty said that, when she came back through the room to bank the stove for the night, the two of them were just sitting quiet in the lamplight, not talking at all, comfortable in it the way people are who have said the true things and don't need to fill the silence, and the boy asleep between them, and it looked, Hetty said, dabbing her eyes when she told me, like a family, like something that ought to have always been there and had only just now found its way home. I want to be careful here, because Clara Denton was nobody's rescued maiden, and I'll not tell it as though she was. She did not need Levi Thorne to save her. She'd been saving herself and that boy and half the town for 6 years before he rode down the notch, on her own 2 feet, with nothing but her will and her wits and a schoolteacher's salary that Hale's grip on the town had not paid in full in months. What she needed, what she'd earned the right to, though she'd never have asked, was someone to stand beside her so that once, just once, she did not have to carry the whole weight alone. That is a different thing than being rescued. That is what a good marriage is, when you come down to it, and I think they both knew that was the shape of the thing well before either of them said a word about it. Hale did not sit still while all this was happening. He was not a man who moved in the open, and his answer to Levi Thorne was, at first, patient, like everything he did. He tried to buy him. That's the first thing he did. He sent word down through Marshal Prout, all proper, that Mr. Hale would pay Mr. Thorne handsomely to ride on, no hard feelings, $100 just to be gone by Sunday. Thorne heard the offer out, Prout delivered it in the livery, sweating, hating himself, and he said, "Tell Mr. Hale I've been paid to leave a lot of places. It's the first time anyone's paid me to leave one worth staying in. I believe I'll stay." And Prout went white and carried the message back, and Hale understood, then, that this was not a thing he could buy his way out of, which for a man like Hale was nearly the end of the world. Then he tried the law. He had that lawyer's paper, the flaw in the old Wells deed, the unsettled note, and he took it to the county seat, 2 days' ride off, to file his claim on the schoolhouse land proper. And this was the dangerous thing, because a paper filed in a courthouse is worse than any number of coal ganses. You can face down a man with a gun. You cannot face down a signature in a ledger. And the word came back that the county judge had looked at Hale's paper and found it good enough to hear, and a hearing was set, and if it went Hale's way it would be legal, and lawful theft is the only kind that truly can't be undone. That was where it stood the morning Clara came to my office, white to the lips, with the notice in her hand. "He's found something," she said. She put the paper on my table. It was a copy of Hale's filed claim, and it laid out the whole cruel machinery of it, that Abel Wells, when he founded the town, had borrowed money to survey and lay out the plat, and had borrowed it from a bank that had failed, and the failed bank's paper had been bought up cheap by a speculator, and that speculator's paper had been bought, 3 years back, by Ezekiel Hale, who had been building this exact trap for exactly this day since before any of us knew his name. The note was against the town land. If it was valid, Hale could foreclose on all of it, the schoolhouse, the spring, the whole heart of Wells Hollow. "Is it valid?" I asked. "I don't know," Clara said, and her voice shook, which I had never heard it do. "That's the terrible part, Josiah. I don't know, it might be. He's a careful man. He wouldn't file it if it weren't good enough to win." She sat down hard in my patient's chair. "I've fought him with the truth this whole time. The land belongs to the town, but the truth doesn't matter if he's got a better piece of paper, and he might just own us, legally, forever." And she put her face in her hands, and I saw the whole 6 years of it, the widow who'd carried a town, break for just a minute in my office, where no one could see but me. I did the only thing I knew to do, which was fetch Thorne. He came and read the paper, slow, running one finger down it, and he was quiet a long while. Then he said, "There's a wrong thing in here." "Where?" Clara said. "I don't know where," Thorne said. "I'm no lawyer. But I've had a lot of these papers waved at me over the years, Miss Denton. Hale's kind, they always overreach. They can't help it. They've won so many times honest men rolled over that they get careless and they put a thing in the paper that isn't true because they never expected anyone to check." He tapped the notice. "This note, bought 3 years back, it says, from a speculator. But look here, the date, it says Abel Wells signed the original. That true? When did Wells found this town?" Clara went still. "The founding's carved on the town well," she said slowly. "Wells set the plat in the spring of '61. I've read it 100 times. And this note," Thorne said, "says Wells borrowed against the plat in the fall of '60. He looked up. "A man can't borrow against a plat he hasn't laid yet. Can he? Can't mortgage land that isn't surveyed. Whoever forged this note, or backdated it to make the debt older than the town's claim so it'd come first in line. They got greedy and they got sloppy, and they put a date in it that can't be true, because the proof it can't be true is carved into a well in the middle of your own town square where anybody can read it. The room went very quiet. Clara took the paper back and read it again, and her hands were steady now, steady as I'd ever seen them, because there is nothing steadies a person like a fighting chance where a minute before there'd been none. "It's a forgery," she said, "or a fraud at the least. The date proves it. If the original note is dated before the founding, either it's forged or the debt it's built on was never against this land at all, and Hale knows it, and he filed it anyway betting nobody in a dying town would have the money or the nerve to fight it to the courthouse." She looked up at Thorne and then at me. "We can beat him. In open court in front of the judge with the founding date and the note date side by side, we can beat him. He's finally reached too far." "Then that's what you do," Thorne said. "You take it to the courthouse." "He won't let it get to the courthouse," Clara said, and the steadiness stayed but a coldness came into it. "You know he won't. The hearing's 4 days off. He'll have realized the flaw by now. He's not a stupid man. He can't afford to let this go before a judge with the well in the square proving him a liar. So he'll do the only thing left. He'll make sure there's no case to hear. He'll take the land the old way tonight or tomorrow and burn the deed record while he's at it. And by the time the judge convenes, there'll be nothing to argue and no one left to argue it." She folded the paper. "He's going to come, isn't he?" "Yes," Thorne said, "he's going to come." And he did. The last part I saw all of, because when word went around the hollow that night that Hale meant to move, I did what I should have done weeks before, and what shames me that it took me so long. I went up the hill and I stood with them. And I was not the only one. That's the part of the story I love best, and it is the part that has the least to do with Levi Thorne's gun, and the most to do with the truth he'd been putting on us like water on stone all those weeks. Because when it came to it, when the thing everyone had been so afraid of finally arrived, Wells Hollow discovered it was not so cowardly as it had come to believe. It was Thorne who set it up, but it was not Thorne's gun that won it, and I want that understood because he'd have wanted it understood. He gathered us in the schoolhouse that evening, the men of the town, the ones who'd have signed Hale's paper a month back, Boone and Prout and the Peterson men and the mercantile Larkin and a dozen others, and he stood at the front of the schoolroom where Clara stood every day, and he did not make a speech because he was not a speech-making man. He said, "Hale's coming for the spring. Tonight, most likely. His men'll ride in expecting what they always find, which is a town that looks the other way. Now, I can face Cole Gantz. I've faced men like Gantz my whole life, and it doesn't frighten me anymore, which is its own kind of sorrow, but there it is. What I can't do is face them and hold this land at the same time. One man can't hold a town's water. A town holds a town's water." He looked around at us, that clear, tired look. "So the question's not whether I'll fight, I will. The question's whether you will. Because if it's just me, we lose the thing that matters. Even if I win, you'll have kept your spring because a stranger's gun kept it, and the next Hale that comes, you'll look the other way again. But if it's all of you, if he rides in and finds the whole town standing in the road, then he's beat, tonight and for good, and it won't have taken a single shot. He can kill one gunfighter. He can't foreclose on a whole town that's decided to stand up. There's not enough bullets in the valley for that, and he knows it, and more than that, he can't afford it. One killed farmer and the county comes down on him, and his careful paper empire comes apart. His whole power is that nobody makes him spend it, so we make him spend it. We stand in the road, and he blinks." There was a long silence in that schoolroom, and then Clara Denton stood up from the bench where she sat, with Sam beside her, and she said, "I've been standing in that road by myself for a month. I'll stand in it tonight. I'd be obliged for the company." And she walked to the front and stood beside Thorne, and there was a thing in how they stood, close, easy, that told the whole room what perhaps the two of them had not yet quite told each other, that this was two people now, not one. And Boone stood up. Boone, who was afraid of his shadow, he stood up and he said, "Aw, hell, which was the bravest thing I ever heard that man say. I'm in the mercantile's debt to Hale up to my neck anyway. Can't be worse standing than running. And then Larkin stood, and then the Peterson men, and then, one by one, the whole cowardly, decent, exhausted town of Wells Hollow got to its feet in that schoolroom. And even Prout, our useless marshal, stood up last and put on his badge like he just remembered what it was for, and said he'd bring the county judge's own name into it, threaten Hale with the law he'd been hiding from, and by God he did later, and it mattered. They came near midnight. I heard the horses first. A lot of them, 10 or 12, Hale had emptied his bunkhouse for this, and they came up the road to the schoolhouse rise expecting the dark, quiet yard they'd always found. And instead they found the whole of Wells Hollow standing in the road with lanterns lit, 30, 40 people, men and their wives, and the schoolhouse behind them with every window bright, and Levi Thorne standing out front of all of them with his rifle held down along his leg, not raised, just held. And Clara Denton beside him with the town's deed in her hands and the notice of Hale's forged claim in the other, and Marshal Prout beside her with his badge on, and a look on his face like a man who has finally decided which side of himself to be. Ezekiel Hale himself was with them that night. It was the only time I ever saw him ride with his own men. He came up on a fine black horse, and he sat there at the front of his riders looking at the lit road full of standing people, and I watched him understand, in real time, that the thing his whole careful power depended on, that no one would ever make him spend it in the open, had just come undone. "This is my land," Hale said. His voice was smooth, but I heard the crack in it. "I've a legal claim. These people are trespassing on property I hold the note to." "Your note's a forgery, Mr. Hale," Clara said, and her voice rang out clear as the school bell down the whole length of that road. "It's dated the fall of 1860. Abel Wells didn't lay this town's plat until the spring of 1861. It's carved in the well in the square not 100 yards from where you sit. You can't hold a note against land that wasn't surveyed when you claim it was signed. Your claim's a lie, and it's a lie any judge can read in 10 minutes, and that's why you're here in the dark with a dozen guns instead of at the courthouse in 4 days like an honest man. Because you know the minute this goes before a judge, you're finished, aren't you?" You could hear the whole valley hold its breath. Hale's men shifted in their saddles. Cole Gantz at Hale's shoulder had his hand near his gun, and his eyes on Thorne, and Thorne was looking back at him with that weary patience, and I do believe that if one shot had been fired that night the whole thing would have gone to blood, and I'd have been up all night with the dying. It hung on the edge of that. It hung on it for the longest 10 seconds of my life. And then Marshal Prout stepped forward into the lantern light with his badge shining, and he said, in a voice that shook and then steadied, "Ezekiel Hale, I'm putting you on notice. There's 40 witnesses on this road tonight to a forged claim and armed men brought to enforce it. Judge Abelman convenes in 4 days, and I aim to be the first man in his courtroom. You fire one shot here tonight, you burn one record, you lay one hand on one of these people, and it's not a land dispute anymore. It's murder and arson, and I'll ride to the county myself and swear it out, and all your paper won't save you from a rope. Now, you want this land. Come get it in the daylight in the courthouse in front of the judge with your note and our well, or turn around and ride home. Those are the 2 roads, Mr. Hale. Choose." It was Thorne's own words, near enough choose that he'd given Cole Gantz in the schoolyard a month before, come round now out of the mouth of the town's own weak marshal made suddenly strong, and I have always thought that was the truest sign of what Levi Thorne did in Wells Hollow. He didn't save us. He made us able to save ourselves, and then he stood back and let us do it, which is the harder and the better thing, and the thing a gun alone can never accomplish. Ezekiel Hale sat on his black horse and looked at the lit road and the standing town and the badge and the deed and the woman who'd caught him in his lie, and he was too smart a man not to know when the machine had jammed. His whole power was quiet and lawful seeming, and it depended on darkness, and on no one ever standing up, and here was a road full of people standing up in the light with witnesses, and he could not spend the blood it would take to move them without spending himself. He knew it. I watched him know it. "Cole," he said at last, very quietly, "we're going." "Boss," Gant started. "We're going." And Ezekiel Hale turned his fine black horse around in the road, and his men turned with him, and they rode back down out of the light. And the town of Wells Hollow stood in the road and watched them go and did not cheer, because it was too big for cheering. And somebody's baby started to cry. And old Boone started to laugh, this shaky, wondering laugh. And then we were all of us laughing and crying at once in the lantern light. 40 people who had finally stood up. And it had cost us not one drop of blood. Hale went before Judge Abelman 4 days later because he had to, because Prout made him, and it went exactly as Clara had said. The judge laid the note beside the founding date and threw Hale's claim out in less time than it takes to tell it, and fined him besides for filing a fraudulent instrument. And though Hale was too rich and too careful to be ruined by it, the spell was broken. A man like Hale rules by the belief that he cannot be beaten, and Wells Hollow had beaten him in open court in front of the county, and after that the homesteaders he'd squeezed took heart, and lawyers took their cases, and within 2 years Ezekiel Hale had sold up and moved on to some other valley that didn't know yet not to look the other way. The Mercers came back. Old Mercer farmed that flat below the notch another 9 years and died in his own bed, which is all any man can ask. And Levi Thorne stayed. He never did ride out. I think he'd known he wouldn't from the moment he stood by his gray that first morning with his hand on the saddle and couldn't make himself mount. He married Clara Denton in the spring, in the schoolhouse, with the whole town there and the spring running clear behind it. And I stood up with him because by then I was his friend. And Sam stood up beside Clara in a collar too tight for him, grinning so hard his face liked to split, no stammer in him at all. And when the parson asked was there any reason these two should not be joined, 40 people who a year before could not look a bully in the eye sat in that schoolhouse in a silence that dared the world to say a word, and the world knew better. He put down the gun. I want to tell you that plain because it matters, and because it was the thing he'd been reaching for all those 20 years. He hung the pistol on a nail over the schoolhouse door, and he took up the farm below the notch, not Mercer's, a piece of his own, and he became, at the last, the thing he'd set out to be before the fire took it all the first time. A farmer, a husband, a father to a boy who was not his blood and became his son in every way that counts. I doctored this town for 40 more years, and I brought Clara and Levi's own 2 children into the world, and I set Sam's arm when he broke it falling out of the cottonwood behind the school, and I closed Levi Thorne's eyes myself when his time came, an old man in his own bed with his wife's hand in his and his children around him, which is a death he'd once told me, digging a poor widow's grave, that he never thought a man like him had any right to hope for. I am the last one now. I have outlived all of them, which is the curse of a long life and a doctor's constitution, and I sit here in the hollow that is a proper town now, with a bank and a church and a school that Clara's grandchildren attend, and the spring still runs clear out of the rock behind the schoolhouse where it always has, free, belonging to no one man and so to all of us, the way Abel Wells meant it, and the way a gunfighter and a schoolteacher and a road full of frightened people made sure it stayed. People still tell the story of the night the town stood in the road. They've made it bigger than it was in some ways and smaller in others. They talk about Levi Thorne's gun, but I was there, and I'll tell you the truth of it, which is the last thing I have to give. He never fired it. Not once, that whole business. The most dangerous man any of us ever knew came to Wells Hollow and stood in front of the thing that mattered, and the miracle of it was not the gun. The miracle was that he made a cowardly town brave and a lonely woman less alone, and a frightened boy able to say his own name without stumbling. And he did all of it not by killing but by refusing, one time, to be too late. "That's enough," he said that first morning to 3 armed men in a schoolyard. "That's enough." And it was. It was exactly in the end enough.